Hi, this is Andrew Sears, and I'm going to talk about social class and social class identity. Let me first start off by defining social class. Now, class is a combination of what I call the objective definition, and one important point to make is almost all writing and teaching on social class will use this objective definition, and that's really basically saying class is based on what you can measure. So that's going to be family income, assets, and job type, education, and then sometimes you might get access to social capital. And then there is a subjective definition, which is level of exposure to group trauma and oppression, culture, and that includes lifestyle, language, dress, food, values, status level in community and society, and the class identity of those closest to you that you identify with: friends, neighborhood, community, and family. Now, it's important to recognize that many people will have very complex class backgrounds and avoid oversimplifying class into objective definitions. Many people just say that person comes from a lower class background just based on a very simple definition. It almost never works that way. Usually most people are more complicated than that. And let me break that down a little bit. So previously I talked about the four quadrants. You have the individual perspective, the collective perspective, the internal or subjective perspective, and the external objective perspective. And what happens is social class almost entirely gets defined in this quadrant here, the external individual perspective. So you're talking about it in terms of family income and assets. So it's about money, right? Or maybe sometimes it's about job type, or it's about education. Or you might also look at it from a societal level. You might look at the effect of laws and systems that limit class mobility, or might define specific groups into classes, or might cause systemic oppression of groups. Now, one thing to recognize, there's other aspects. So this is the subjective. So the personal would be exposure to trauma and oppression. That would also be your class background. So later in life, you might get better education, but you're always internally going to have this class background. And then culturally, you have class as culture. One of the big things that my paper on social class talks about is how important class is culture. So your lifestyle, your language, your dress, your food, your values, etc. And social capital is also cultural. So that's your network of relationships. You can have high social capital if those relationships can do a lot for you. You know, people say it's not what you know, it's who you know. If you have high social capital, then that's very true, right? And class identification, we'll talk a little bit more about that in the class identity of those who are closest to you. Now, one of the main points is to recognize that what happens in society is there is this assimilative process where we just all agree to follow an objectivist definition of social class, which is really how those in what I call the dominant class, how they would define it. But this quadrant down here, this cultural quadrant, is what I would say is the primary quadrant that people from the poor or the non-dominant classes will focus on. So let me talk about the dominant and non-dominant class. So for simplification, we'll use the term dominant class and non-dominant class. So the dominant class is upper middle class and above. And I'm not going to get into all the definitions of that right now. But that's going to be a combination of all those factors you saw. And this, I realize it's hard to get pinned down on very clear answers. And that's part of the problem with social classes. It's not easily clearly defined. So non-dominant class is what I would say is lower middle class, the working class, and below. So why do I insist on having two categories? Well, one of the tendencies and one of the ways that class assimilation happens is there's a book called The Imperial Middle Class. And the idea is that everyone identifies as middle class. And some studies that have shown in the United States, 90% of Americans identify as middle class. That's just not true. But one of the primary ways to avoid discussions on class is for most everyone to say they're middle class. So my view, so for people who get that it's not a good thing to say colorblind, that you're colorblind and you don't see race. I think that the term middle class is kind of like saying you're colorblind. It's saying I'm not going to talk about class. Everyone's middle class. So now let people self-identify based on 4 aspects of their class identity is basically how I'm defining class. Probably the most important aspect of it is people self-identify. So there's 4 aspects of class identity. Class background, that's how you grew up. Class identification, I'll break that down. Class access and class consciousness. So class background, so that is going to significantly affect your current culture, your values, your community. So even if you become more wealthy, that's still going to affect your worldview. So that's going to may affect your language, your dress, your friends, your neighborhood. Your family ties can have very significant impact across generations. So you might become more wealthy, but then everyone in your family, you need to help out or other things. And the other thing is exposure to group trauma can have lingering effects. So, you move out of the hood and there's this kind of survivor's guilt that can happen. And, survivor's guilt is one of those things that came from wars where one person might survive in a battle and then they have guilt that they survived. And often for people who gain class access, there's this survivor's guilt. So for each of these, I would say, what's the godly goal for Christians? I'm providing this also from a Christian perspective. So the godly goal is to understand class background and its unique role in bringing class reconciliation. So the next term is, what's your current class access? Now, an oversimplification of that would be social capital. I just wanted to use a term that more people are familiar with. But social capital is really, who are your social relationships and how can you turn those into useful things in your community or useful things monetarily? So that is going to be your current income, your job type, your assets. Do you have white collar, blue collar job, or are you unemployed? Your education, your appearance and speech, your access to social capital, and your cultural fluency and dominant class culture. So I believe that a godly goal is that people should focus on increasing their class access, their social capital to all groups. It's part of why we run a university. One of the things the university does is try to increase class access. Now, unfortunately, most universities, in my view, are primarily vehicles of class assimilation, because what they do is they increase class access, but they also change class identification. So I'll talk about that. Class consciousness is the ability to perceive and understand systems of classism, understand your own class identity, to understand your class role culturally and in the systems, understand class as culture, and to understand cultural class conflicts and all other aspects of class. So the idea is to increase class consciousness. Now, I'm not talking about a class consciousness the way Marxists define it. I'm talking about it in these terms. And the reality is, in the United States and most Western societies, we have had our class consciousness suppressed severely for a lot of reasons. And in some ways, during the Cold War, anyone who talked about class was, you're afraid that they might be a communist. But what that did is that led to generations that just had no ability to talk about social class. So then the last thing is your class identification. And one thing I want to emphasize on class identification that a lot of people don't get is class identification is actually a social identification. So some of it could be, who you're attempting to identify with, but it has, I would say, the primary class identification is based on who's the class identity of those who you're closest to and who you identify with. So who are your people? Your friends, your community, your family, and it's collectively defined by your community. But that's, I would say, the main way, but it also is, how are you allocating your resources towards class groups? How are you spending your money, your work, your time? Are you working at a job that primarily serves the poor? Are you working at a job that just serves a general function that serves everyone? Are you working at a job that, primarily serves the rich? And that's going to affect your identification. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad. It's just going to affect your identification. Then your accessibility to a class group based on your culture, your appearance, your language, and your location. So part of what we're trying to do is to identify with the lower class as the least of these as much as possible, and also in doing that to extend your own social capital to other people. So how accessible are you? You know, if you are working with, whenever I played basketball and I lived in the hood, I dressed like I was in the hood, but whenever I go get a grant, I dress in a suit, right? So then what's the dominant class culture of your work environment and which groups your work serves, and what is your role in addressing or perpetuating classism? So to put that in summary, you have 4 areas of identity. Class background, the step of growth is understand your own background and purpose. Class access or social capital, it's to try to be upwardly mobile. Class identification is to be downwardly mobile. Jesus said that we're to identify with the poor, have a preferential prioritization of the poor. Not that they're better, but because they get neglected. We live in an upside down kingdom. And then in class consciousness, it's just to grow in consciousness. Now, the class identity development, and also I have a paper on ethnic identity development. I'm not going to go into that in here. You start in almost everyone, and this would be in a lower class background, and I'm going to go, middle, upper class or dominant class background, but you start in unawareness. So you're unaware of class identity and classism. And in awareness, you're going to you're going to get immersed in middle and upper classes. I remember whenever I went, especially, so I grew up in the hood, and I worked at a Burger King where everyone did drugs. I worked in a neighborhood where everyone was, in non-dominant classes. And whenever I went to MIT, it was an eye-opening. I told them stories about, my friends putting couches on the railroad tracks, and I just thought everyone did that. And all of a sudden I had this huge awareness that not everyone did that. And they looked at me like I was, crazy. They looked at me, honestly, I think they judged me and probably would have called me poor white trash behind my back. So, and then, I became much more aware of social class. So often that happens through college. You become aware of your class background. But what happens is most colleges, I would say 99% of colleges, they want you to develop a upwardly mobile class identification. So it's the idea that you're going to move up and out. And then stage 3, and most people get stuck there. So they move up and out and they never move back in. So immersion with lower classes means you become class conscious, you embrace your class background, and you also try to identify back with your class background, and you move back to the hood. So you don't become assimilated, you become class acculturated, right? So, and you move back to the hood. That could be physically back to the hood, or it could be, in how your life is oriented and how you're giving back to the community. And stage 4 is holiness, where you embrace your unique class identity while integrating the strengths from all class backgrounds and working to address classism and economic oppression while continuing to identify with the poor. So that is for non-dominant. For dominant, it's going to be somewhat similar. You're going to start off unaware with class identity and role in classism, and then you're going to grow in awareness in economic oppression and classism, but most of the processing happens on the head level. And then stage 3, immersion with the lower classes, that might be relocating and living among the poor, and you embrace a downwardly mobile class identity. You become more class conscious, choosing to identify with the poor. Now, one really important thing to recognize is a lot of people will conflate class with race. And honestly, that's super damaging, not helpful. And often what I've found is people will understand class if they are interacting with different class groups of the same race, then they'll be able to perceive class. But often if they're interacting where there's a difference across both race and class, they attribute the differences across class also to race, which isn't as helpful. And then holiness would be you embrace your unique class identity. That doesn't mean you have to say, I grew up poor, or I am poor. But you embrace who God made you to be, and you integrate your strengths from all backgrounds, and you still work to address classism, economic oppression, while continuing to identify with the poor. That doesn't mean your identity is with the poor. It means you're going to be downwardly oriented. So, quick summary. So I talk about social identity of development across race, class, and gender. I have readings that cover race and ethnicity, and then class. I don't cover gender, but a lot of the gender identity development follow a similar path. And the idea is that at each stage, you start with unawareness, then you become aware of this racial, class, social identity, and you make a decision to pursue awareness. And then you become aware of racism, classism, and then you realize that it's not enough just to learn on your head, and you want to learn in your heart. And then you process a lot of this stuff on an emotional level, and using your hands to heal the effect of racism, classism, sexism, and broken relationships through action, reconciliation, forgiveness, and then continuing reconciliation by addressing social injustice, bringing social healing, and addressing personal cultural brokenness. So that's a lot to that. Now, one of the things I want to talk about, so I've talked about social class largely from an individual perspective, but I want to talk about it from an organizational perspective, because most organizations are going to be somewhere you have this bridge between, often if you're serving the poor, you have this bridge between the clients that you're serving and the resources. And, I mentioned I've worked with several hundred organizations that are doing community development, and I found that there's a huge cluster of organizations that are very close to their clients. Then there's a huge cluster of organizations that are very close to their funders. And ultimately, what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to be a bridge. So that's why I've drawn this bridge there. But you want to think about, where is the class culture of your organization? And you can do that by looking at some of the cultural dimensions that I have in my paper, but I'm not going to go into all that right now because it's more complicated. Now, ultimately, you're trying to be able to bridge those to be an organization that has culture between clients and funders. Now, another way of looking at this is, what's your primary focus? And one of the things I've seen, many people have heard of this thing called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the idea, it was a psychologist, and he said, and not that this is entirely true, but on average, people first focus on their physiological needs, so food, water, and shelter. Then they focus on their safety and security needs. So that's protection from violence and trauma. Then they focus on belongingness and love. And then they focus on their self-esteem, and then self-actualization. So for instance, if you're about to die of hunger or die of dehydration, you're not sitting here thinking about, how do I get the most fulfilling job that makes me feel like I'm, doing who, I'm living out who I am, right? Now, what happens is, depending on where your social class center of your organization is, you're going to have a bias towards different needs, right? So if you're in the non-dominant class needs and ministries, then these things are going to be really important: global relief, food ministry, housing ministry, medical ministries, after school programs. So, safety for kids, educational and job programs. And then, I've been in middle class churches, and these programs are awesome. Counseling programs, small groups, social activities, and leadership development, and, personal identity development, finding your calling. But what happens is, there's this bias where a lot of dominant class will say, well, these needs at the top half are the spiritual needs, and these needs down here are not spiritual. And as we talked about before, you can't separate out those, because the gospel's a whole. You can't separate them. So again, another way of looking at this is, you have holistic ministry across 4 quadrants. And, we talked about the different quadrants, and depending on where you're coming from, if you are coming from a middle-class community, then these things around the physical needs, food and clean water programs and homeless shelters, that's not going to really be needing, helping to meet your needs personally, right? It's going to be these things. So, and then also, if you're in a dominant culture, then the whole culture around is affirming your culture. So you don't need, have as much need to have things like Black history because you're in the dominant culture. So this gets into, how do you think about the four quadrant social class and the poor? So, and how do these quadrants differ if you're looking at this from the lens of the poor? So one is, a lot of people say you shouldn't focus as much on personal salvation with the poor. I think that's completely wrong. It's the easiest thing you can do. You can change someone's heart. It doesn't cost any money. And it's one of the most accessible things to do. So that is absolutely critical to change someone's life. Now, but they need their physical needs met while their spiritual needs have been met. And one of our board members who's on the Salvation Army, they saw for people who went through recovery programs, what were the determinants to them staying sober, a year out. One of them was staying in church. So that actually goes into this cultural dimension. It was community, but the other one was getting a job and getting housing, right? And then they would stay following Jesus. So I think a significant factor is the poor often choose the heart over the head, and they value churches and worship styles that fit their culture over churches that might have the cognitive, ideological, or political stances that are pro-poor, right? And then the other thing to recognize in this quadrant on systems is, the poor are deeply affected by unjust systems, but often they don't have the pull to be able to affect political change as much. So often denominations of the poor are more apolitical, partly because they don't have the tools to do this. So a key role for Christians in the dominant class is advocacy and social change. So hopefully all this is helpful, and just recognizing how all these factors affect the poor, that personal salvation is important, but you can't separate out physical needs. Recognizing the importance of culture, and that's often the dominant quadrant of the poor, and to recognize that advocacy and social change often happens, but often the poor don't have those resources. So hopefully you find this helpful. And if you have any questions, ask your professor. Thanks a lot.